Good afternoon, and thank you for being here. Apparently, I'd heard that there was supposed to be a celebrity turning up at this time in the afternoon, but instead they got us, the disruptors, the English disruptor with some Welsh blood living up in the Welsh Black Mountains, and Jess and Jack. But more importantly, you guys, and we are going to have a conversation. It's very much about not setting the scene, because we're going to dip our toes in the ocean. We're going to go into woods and fields and maybe into the towns. And we're going to go around the world a little bit talking about alliances for conservation in all their forms. And I think sometimes we talk about all the success stories. Let's learn about some of the lessons which are just as valuable about some alliances, partnership, collaboratives which haven't worked, because that can inform. And this, I think, is not about big alliances between big organizations. This is definitely coming from the grassroots to talk about some of the examples. I'm going to sit down, but then I'm also going to stand here, and I'm going to get you guys, I'm going to say any questions or put your hand up, and then I'm going to walk towards you in order to record it. So I've just been told that. I've got about 40 minutes apparently, and then the recording goes dead. So if you want some really kind of off-record stuff, wait till after 40 minutes and then say it. Anyway, I'm going to sit down. Please, Jess and Jack, just give about a minute, quite personal, as to who you are, where you're from, without running too deep into the stuff.
Okay, yeah, I can go. So, hi everyone. I'm Jess. I'm the new Wild Atlantic Rainforest Project Manager for Home Tree, which is pretty cool. But I'm not going to talk to you today about rainforests, and I'm not going to talk about Home Tree, because there's people in the room that will be able to talk about that better. So I'm going to talk about myself. But for my 1 minute, because I think that Rob's going to be strict with the timing. So for my first sort of context, 1 minute, my Home Tree origin story is actually Art and Colour Summer School. So last year, I was cycling around Ireland, or cycling around the Burren, on my way to the Willie Clancy Festival, if anyone knows Willie Clancy. Woo! There we go. And and I'd heard about Home Tree, like I'd been sort of fangirling them, like following them on Instagram, following Ray on Twitter. He's a good man on Twitter. Give him a follow. And they're just up to amazing stuff. So while I was in the Burren, I was like, cool, this summer school's on, I'm going to check it out. And there was an amazing workshop by a very cool bloke called Joe Hope, who was running a lichen identification workshop, and it was phenomenal. And 1 year later, I am here living in Ennistimon or in Clahan and working for Home Tree. So
that is wonderful.
That's my intro. And a warning to all of you, so you might find yourselves in a year's time.
That's great stuff, because I think Joe Hope is also from Wales. Anyway, yes. Jack.
Good stuff. My name is Jack O'Donovan Traw. I'm from Clonakilty, West Cork. And I am a conservation biologist. I've worked across curlew conservation, now working in marine conservation, advocating for the creation of marine protected areas in Ireland. So now my work focuses on a lot of research, trying to engage with coastal communities, the fishing community, this new offshore wind sector that's coming in, trying to see how we can ensure that we have balance in the ocean to ensure that our ocean recovers, because it's not in a very good state as it is. But really for me, what I think, like I grew up in, Clonakilty is a small town, like when I was growing up, it was 4,000 people. My mother had a restaurant, we were born above it on the main street. Like you were raised by the village, really was the way it was then. And like for me, that I feel like I have a great sense of community. Like, when I go home, you know everyone, everyone's your neighbour. But then growing up into wildlife conservation in Ireland, it's almost like you're the enemy, especially when we lived in a small area and my uncles are farmers, you have, that kind of thing. I love the sense of community, but I feel like I just don't have it. I feel like I'm putting myself on the outside of it sometimes with work. So now, and I think, we've all experienced this, what I love seeing is the integration of, say, more traditional things like the gun clubs, the upland farmers, and now everyone trying to be brought into this conversation, because that's it. We've kind of, these things have fractured, but I think what we're going to talk about is how we bring that all back together again.
Great, thank you very much for that. So you could call it counterintuitive conservation, having alliances with people who might have slightly different values, but common purpose. Okay, first of all, very quickly, who's in the room? Just raise your hands. Farmers, which is a big term, farming what? Okay, farmers, foresters, who owns a gun? Kind of gun clubs, okay, there's ecology, ecology. Anyone else want to shout out anything which we haven't kind of, there's lots of different voices in the room. But the point is we already have NGOs, yeah, artists, exactly, there we are, yeah, exactly. And that's what we want to harvest. I think we can get resilience within diversity. Of course, it's very hard to know where to start. We could start with the sea, because something you said, or I may have heard it before, fishermen aren't the same as anglers. Just unpack that a little bit. So when someone says we need to do a marine conservation area and they call someone something, it disenfranchises a whole other group. Just unpack that a little bit.
Yeah, I guess this is something we were talking about whenever you hear, especially from a top level, maybe a big NGO, or you might hear, the government mostly saying, oh, we're engaging with stakeholders. They might say fishermen or fishers. And they're putting in anglers, they're putting in potters, lobster and crab fishermen, they're putting in the drift netters. When that was happening, they're putting in everyone lumped into this one thing where you have totally not only different in the water practices, but totally different socioeconomic circumstances, like an angler compared to, say, a fisherman. So for anyone who doesn't know, angling is more of it's a sport, it's angling, it's on our rivers, it's at sea, whereas fishing, like small-scale fishing, could be something like potting for lobsters and crabs. So they're very different things, and we were chatting to someone who's here earlier on, Rob, if he's in the room, I don't know, he could feed into this, but he was kayaking on the Blackwater, which is a big river in Ireland, and backing onto the Blackwater is a lot of very, very large estates that were given away to British landowners. And what happened is when we got our independence, rather than the fishing rights returning from the estates to the local community who used to make their living off it, they were given to angling clubs, which were much higher socioeconomic standing than the fishing. So it just turned from one high-level, inaccessible thing almost to another, and it created this then dichotomy between the anglers and the fishermen, where they probably were intermixed, but it just kind of spread them apart a little bit.
And where do you think that introduction needs to take place? Where do you think that kind of, oh, hang on, before we do that, we need to, anyone want to have any comment on that, on this particular issue, about where to interject before it suddenly goes down a rabbit hole of being perceived as with a completely different group as to what they expected them to be for the purposes?
Well, for anybody here who's worked with stakeholders, like often I'm sure everyone is aware that the first thing you do before you go and engage with stakeholders is do a lot of research before you go in there and understanding them, rather than just, because often you'll go in and people think that asking a really broad question is something that's respectful, but often it's disrespectful because they're like, if you're coming to talk to me and you don't know this already, then we're not going to get all this work done, So I think often doing our research, taking the nuance then and really building from a good foundation, but going in with a mutual kind of understanding and respect for what this person is doing already,
Yeah. Anyone want to just put your hand up if you suddenly want to add anything or interject, please, at any time. Yeah, I spend a lot of time at the interface between practitioners and scientists, and there's a huge amount of fascinating science papers about the role of trust in the resolution of conservation, why facts don't change mind. Do you think that sometimes there are some conservationists who say, look, we need to have it evidence-based, but the evidence-based you seem to be hinting at, Jack, is get the social science evidence and then build the ecological stuff on top of that, so layer it on top?
I could maybe jump in on that. So I didn't give this background intro to myself, but before joining Home Tree, I was working in BirdLife International, so it's a bird conservation charity. And before that, I was working with landowners and hunting communities. So I was in Brussels working for the association or the organisation that represented landowners and hunting associations. So that's my background is straddling sort of both of those things. But working in BirdLife, so in a purely conservation organisation, there's this funny kind of disconnect when you work in conservation that you're working with humans. You're trying to conserve habitat or preserve species or whatever it is, and you're working with loads of biologists who know nothing about humans, or at least don't think of them as sort of a valid, subject matter. So there was no sociologists in BirdLife until I joined, and I was sort of banging a pot saying, lads, we're working with communities and we're working with hunters. I was working on illegal hunting, so we were working with, poachers and trappers. We don't understand the motivations, we don't understand the human element. So that thing about having an evidence base, I would say you also need the sociological evidence-based or socioeconomic evidence-based to try and understand what's motivating people to do what they're doing. If you're trying to convince them to do something else, why are they doing it in the first place? And then what can you use to convince them, and how are you going to speak the same language? And it's a little bit dry, like to do a sociological survey on a community that you're going to be working with, because it creates that distance between you and them. So like there has to be, I don't know if you've come across it, but like, a balance between like doing a survey on a population sort of is a bit harsh, and then also coming back to them and having a conversation where you're speaking the same language.
Sure. So to use, say, intermediaries that are trusted rather than social scientists, and I'm aware of that. The government organisations say, and they did this thing in the UK, how to reach hard to reach farmers, and they use social scientists to do it. Do you think they got the answers they were looking for? No, they didn't, because the farmers didn't trust the social scientists asking the question. So there's this. I just, Jess, you didn't also mention the bit that they very kindly said that I also would.
Yeah, so Rob is going to sit down sometime, maybe not sit down at all, but you're a fellow panelist, so you're also going to give some contributions and not just moderate.
So I just wanted to apologise that if I do talk too much, I have been invited in order to put this. And just on this note about coming together, because I've got lots of examples over my years of experience, and I was in Estonia 2 or 3 years ago, and there is a round table all about wolves and carnivores, obviously carnivores being bears, lynx and wolves. And at the round table, which meets every kind of 6 weeks, are shepherds, storytellers, hunters, farmers, government, environmental scientists, ecologists, activists. And they meet at the round table, and they look at the stats, they look at the populations of the carnivores, and they work out what the harvest cull is, and that then keeps everyone happy, because it also avoids the conflict, the conservation conflict, by saying overprotect the animal, and then it does that, and then the conflict starts in the population of the wild animal. And Estonia is, I have to say, of what I saw of it, seems to be a brilliant example of coexistence, not just with the carnivores, but between lots of different interested parties. I don't like the word, and you argue with me, I don't like the word stakeholder. For me, a stakeholder is you're holding a stake, and this is my position. An interested party is a little more flex, and maybe we might talk about flexing in other people's, hearing other people's kind of point of view, and not meeting in the middle, but meeting on the common ground, which might be way out there in the corner. Anyone? So I'm just going to hold. No. Yes, hand. I'll come and walk towards you. So I only need to come this far, I think.
Yes, I'd like to
Please.
comment as well on the terminology we use. Maybe also stakeholders. Anyone coming into any area, laying claim upon it, all of a sudden becomes a stakeholder. So I think we have to ask ourselves, how are the power relations implicit in this? Like, who gets to lay which claim upon what, whether it's anglers or fishermen. Even the terminology of poaching, for me that really obfuscates some kind of a usurpation of the commons that underlies that. So I know a man here in Ireland who was jailed for catching a salmon. He was poaching. He caught a salmon in the river.
Yeah.
But so he's a poacher, but then someone else may be trawling the ocean, and essentially, actually, there's a responsibility for the depletion of the oceans and the salmon population. But he's a poacher, so he gets penalized, and I think we have to be really careful with using these terms such as poaching. Essentially, it's just someone who takes, very often just for themselves, what they need or what they want.
Great.
It's always been theirs, and then use this word.
And that was thank you. When you build an alliance for conservation, you sometimes have to worry about the PR department. Sorry, that was quite an obtuse statement, wasn't it? When you're building kind of people working together, the PR department might think that they're going to use words which look very attractive to attract a wide audience. But actually, if you use the wrong word, which is slightly what the gentleman in the back was saying, and I know your name, but I'm just going to refer to, the wrong use of the word at the wrong time can disenfranchise a whole lot of people in your kind of blind spot. Do you think that alliances that want to come together, do they need to keep certain types of operatives away, especially at the start?
Just on that point about poaching, like that, we ran circles around ourselves in just use of language, because when you're talking to one interest group or community group or whatever you want to call them, stakeholder, yeah, you can't use it's like, especially around hunting and around conservation, it's really emotional. That, you know, they're emotive subjects, and the words that you use really hold weight. So yeah, poaching might work in if you're talking to a hunting association that, Rob, I'm sure you're familiar with. So if it's an official hunting association and you talk about poachers, they're probably on board because they're the other guys.
Well, yeah, we're getting into a really dodgy area because I think
But that's the point. That's the point.
Exactly. Okay, let's unlit it then. Yeah. So I have spent time moderating discussions at hunting conservation organizations where they take a group of journalists, half of whom are hunters and half of whom are very strong environmental non-hunting. And I have to harvest their opinions and then take it to this congress of hunting people. And so if someone uses the term illegal hunting, everyone puts their hand up going, well, that's, that is poaching. That has nothing to do with hunting. And that's when I was bringing it back towards the media can just use the word, poacher, and everyone think, yeah, that's about hunting. And you have to split. You've got to get the right wording within the right context, but the context can then change. One person's salmon for his own fridge is not the same as if you've put CIMAG in a river in order to feed 15 hotels, which is what happens in Wales sometimes, or allegedly did.
Just on that, and you just touched on it there, and I think your question is really interesting, and we're kind of getting there where you're talking about a poacher, and who defines that he's the poacher? Well, who are the people that separated the person who was subsistently getting their salmon from a clean river and then all of a sudden says, oh wait, you need a license? It's usually down to what we now believe as a kind of a cultural or societal divide is actually just probably really old policy. So in Ireland, it was through colonization, the separation of land and society from ownership of their land, like genuine legally. But then the redistribution of that power then, when it didn't happen in an equal, in an just way, all of a sudden we have this new regulatory framework that was kind of invented because all of a sudden someone had to do something with all of these rules. So all of a sudden now you're saying, well, we do need licenses. So in Ireland, for example, like obviously it's important because especially we're dealing with two things. We've got this socio-economic and social divide among, say now, fishing, and because we don't live a subsistence lifestyle. We have fishing, and then now someone who's not regulated is poaching. But if we think about it, really, over the last couple of years, I think that what we're seeing is the government trying to fill a gap when it comes to biodiversity. So they have to regulate because numbers are so low, and if everyone was allowed to catch them, they would be gone. But what's happening is that's kind of a band-aid, and they're just putting this system on where it doesn't address maybe a root cause. It doesn't go back far enough. It just says the numbers are low. If you're caught fishing without it, you're going to get a fine. But then again, out in sea, like looking at what happened to deplete the stocks in the first place, and then maybe looking at how we can mitigate some of that pressure. Like it's just the typical thing when you have any modern government, the joined up thinking doesn't happen. To think that even in the Irish government department, when we talk about marine matters, like the ocean is what I'm working in now, that we have the Department of Housing and Planning are the people over marine protected areas and looking after biodiversity in the sea. And then you have agriculture in the marine, which is people who are over, say, fishing, they're over aquaculture, they're over things like that. So we had a minister for the ocean, actually, a minister for the marine in the 1980s. We had one, and Micheál O'Cinnéide from Kerry, he was the advisor to that minister, and he has a wealth of knowledge and a great man for anybody who ever wants to talk to him. But it's just interesting how there is just, I think, a holistic thinking and joined up thinking needed, and that would help, I think, not only to mitigate people like this who are maybe wrongfully not getting access to resources, but also to help to bring people together. Because often when you're talking about, groups who think, what is it, who's causing these problems between groups? It's usually bad policy or the leftover like social fallout because of bad policy. It's the same in Ireland. That's why our rivers were straightened. That's where the bogs were drained. That's why, that is why. And now a lot of farmers think nice and tidy, like around me, all big dairy farms where I grew up. My uncle, 1,000-acre farm, beef and dairy, and it's not a tree in sight. And it's just because he'd be penalised if he had them. And you know what I mean? He doesn't have anything against trees personally, but he thinks he does because it was bad regulation. That was a bit of a long one, but yeah.
The leftovers of bad policy is an interesting one. There's a woods that I know one or two people in this room are familiar with in Kerry that there may be an opportunity, it's an ancient oak wood or an old oak wood, there may be an opportunity to fence it off to it because it's overgrazed and whatever. But there's a question, can it be fenced off because so much spruce has been put in the bogs in the area that there's a low flow threat to the pearl mussel. You know, like the trees are evaporating water away at the wrong time of the year. And so now potentially saving an ancient woodlands might not be, you know, there's a question there because how will it reflect flow rates to the river for a pearl mussel? Totally disconnected and a kind of a perverse policy outcome, but something that people on the ground are actually grappling with.
Yeah, okay. Yeah, I'm going to just riff back to a couple of examples of not bad policy, but maybe, one good example and one bad example of knowing the backstory. Some of you may have heard about the stoat eradication project on the Orkney Islands. Okay, so that is a government policy to remove the invasive native on the mainland only stoat. And so they obviously brought in the environmental NGO who then said, look, we can handle this, we shall do this our way. But what they hadn't done was to go to the pubs and just listen to the story about the grey-lagged goose. And the populations of goose have been going up and affecting the crops, and the organisation that was running the stoat eradication hadn't listened to that story, so they were already resented. And so no wonder they couldn't get access to the farmland because of that quiet backstory about the geese. So that's just an example of where, they had all the money, there was huge funding, but they weren't getting very far by being able to get on the land. And just a good little story from Wales, the Vincent Wildlife Trust have done a reinforcement programme about pine martens. And they're bringing them back to mid-Wales, but they've done it in such a good way. They're in the pubs, they're in the clubs, they're in the farmhouses, and they're with the gamekeepers. And they're saying, I know you hate pine martens, you once did, but now you're going to be part of the process, and it's worked really well. But I think the little subtle difference is the Vincent Wildlife Trust have no members. And so that gives them a certain nimble-footedness to actually do the stuff and engage without having to watch their, did I say PR department again? And I think that I am just going to, we'll stop talking, but I think there's an element about the recruitment marketing department sometimes getting in the way of what really needs to be done.
In the UK, It's not unusual to have, say, the Royal Society for the Protection of Birds, RSPB, 1.2 million members. Greenpeace, their mailing list, 900,000. The Wildlife Trust, over 1 million members. And in Ireland, I wouldn't like to speak for Irish Wildlife Trust, but they might there be 20,000 on Maine?
I think the biggest is Birdwatch Ireland, 15,000 members.
15 or 50?
15000. 15,000.
15,000. So there you go. So I just put it to the room to just reflect on that, and then counter to that, I'd say there's no one in this room who's Irish who doesn't have 1 or 2 generations away from the countryside, that doesn't have a cousin or an aunt and uncle that are farmers. So I think there's an interesting discussion there as to why Irish people feel disconnected from nature, inverted commas, but are at the same time extremely close to the land. And they're not necessarily the same thing. And in fact, you'll often hear British people say, well, you're so close to the land in Ireland. Well, true, we are close in a familial sense, but not always in a nature sense. So I don't have any answers, it's just an observation.
But that's a really good, because I wanted to hold that towards the end, because I think that's where Home Tree is. Go on.
But on that, like those massive membership numbers are often seen as a big advantage, and clearly they are from a funding point of view. But are they also a disadvantage in terms of the RSPB in England? I know hunters who've had to sign gag orders to say that they can't talk about the carnivores that they shoot on behalf of the RSPB, because the RSPB's members don't want to see that they're shooting foxes or whatever it is. And
I was going to talk about, most of my work for BirdLife International, RSPB is a member, Birdwatch Ireland is a member of BirdLife International. I was mostly working in the Mediterranean, and again, it's hunting versus the conservation organisations, but it's really interesting to see the culture in different countries and the membership base. especially, I mean, the RSPB, but especially in like BirdLife Malta or BirdLife Cyprus, they're membership organizations. So the kind of policy is dictated of the organization, the conservation policy is dictated in a way by the membership. And so the members are generally, I mean, this is a generalization, but in general, the people who are signing up to be members of conservation organizations are the kind of urban green intelligentsia, and they've got one idea of nature, and they kind of have that, you were saying, like a disconnect from nature in a way that the landowners and the hunters and the farmers maybe don't. But that makes it really hard for these organizations to operate, to get into a room even with the hunters, because the membership base would just be so diametrically opposed to it that they kind of can't find that common ground. They're not, like, they're restrained from having those conversations, which is a shame, you know? I mean, it is, like you said, there's benefits, but there's also downsides to that membership base. And maybe the job is then, actually you work with your own members and you kind of inform them, because they need to get on board with you talking to the hunters and the farmers and kind of taking the tough decisions in conservation, because it's not always fluffy. I mean, like pest control, you'll maybe talk a bit about, like, you know, eradication. It's not always cute and fluffy working in conservation. Like, bad stuff does need to happen for good things to happen, you know? And sometimes the hunters are on our side.
Yes, yeah.
I appreciate Adrian's point, like, but a small bit of context in the history side is that, like, I'm a 7th generation farmer on a plot of ground, but I'm only the 2nd generation of land ownership. So we're an extremely young state, and at the foundation, and home tree is class, but at foundation of the state we have 1% forestry cover in this country. So, like, when we talk about the Royal Society of Conservation and stuff, is that, like, put in the context of, like, how poor and how new this country has gone. It's like our path has been huge, and we're starting from a very low base.
Yeah, exactly.
True, but but I think that.
Really poor until recently.
But I think there's a huge opportunity. I think there's a huge opportunity within that. But we'll maybe come on to that towards the end, because I've got something in the back of my mind how Ireland can learn from the UK because of.
Hang on now.
Hang on, careful what you say now.
That's the bit we want to hear.
And we were just making the point that actually a lot of the heritage of conservation groups in Britain is inherently colonial. Like, the RSPB was established because of the complete massacre of international wild bird populations for the plumage industry. And if you look at WWF and so on, it was a lot about, let's protect areas of Africa from the natives, so that white people could go out and kill the wildlife. So actually it is an implicitly colonial construct. A lot of and that's not to say that they don't produce good social outcomes today, but they have a very different social context to what we had in Ireland. So yes, I entirely agree with your.
Well, no. Let's. How long we got? Very roughly. Another. Of recording, okay, 15 minutes kind of recording. No, but it's nice recording.
The point I was trying to make earlier, that in Ireland, even when you look at Ireland, is always coming at the bottom of all the lists. So we're being dragged through the European Commission for failure on this regulation. All our waters are polluted. We don't have forest cover. It's like we are being put up against countries who used resources from every other country in the world to build their wealth to the state they are now. They took our resources and are one of the only colonies in Western Europe. No wonder we are at the bottom of the barrel, and we're doing well to be there, you know. So I think there is phenomenal context, and I think as much as that, we're in a biodiversity crisis. Things are urgent, but it does also allow us time to be like, hang on a second, we need to build the relationships between ourselves and rally together like we did in the War of Independence, so that we can re-establish who we are. Like 800 years of our landscape being taken away. We don't know how to live in a landscape because we haven't got the landscape our language was born out of. So there's that ground we need to start from.
And I think that's the opportunity. Not that you're interrupted, it's just that we want to hear. I'm going to bring my point in, because I think that is the interruption. That is the point where Ireland does have a chance, because I'm going to give the example. Everyone says, the UK, they've got so much data about nature. We are 6 or 7 generations away from food, land, and nature, okay? So as a result of that, all the data and the information is owned by the environmental NGOs, and every 3 years they bring out the State of Nature report. On the back of that are just lots of environmental NGOs. No farmers, no fishermen, no hunters, and they're not allowed through the door. I've been slightly trying to petition. And that, I think, is an opportunity for Ireland to kind of, it may be a low bar, I understand it's a low bar, but also a low bar of who has the data. And that is an opportunity for grassroots to use technology and say to environmental organizations, give me your technology, but no, you stay away, keep your PR people away from this. This is our gig, but you can feed into it. But we've got the headline, we do the press release on this. We gather the data on wildlife and nature without judgment as to having to sign up to the organization. I think Ireland does have a chance there.
2 quick points on that, super quick data. One, we did a land cover mapping exercise of Ireland where we, I think it was 97% accuracy, understood all the habitats. It's behind the paywall. Farmers can't actually see the habitats in their own farm. The north of Ireland did a soil testing and every single field in the north gave the data straight back to farmers. Amazing. We don't have it.
No.
A couple of signpost farms.
I've broken the law so many times to bust the paywall to get all these hundreds of papers, and it is an absolute mind blow of information, but it's in the wrong place. I'm not saying it's that easy to read, but it's there, and very good point. Paywall, but this is about ownership of narratives, ownership of the funds, ownership of the knowledge. How do we break that down? Yeah, go.
Well, no, I was just going to say, someone said it a second ago, like, it feels, and maybe this is just me coming back to Ireland after being a while away, but I think I was saying it in our first ever conversation with Ray, talking about conservation in Ireland, like indigenous conservation, you know, like when we were growing up as kids, this is now three Cork people, but like when we were growing up, like I was mad about nature. I was running around in ancient woodlands and collecting mushrooms and like, yeah, just totally fascinated and obsessed. But like no one, I knew that WWF existed, but no one was talking about conservation of preserving Irish nature. You know, conservation was something that happened to, you know, it was panda bears and bamboo, and it was, you know, charismatic animals. It wasn't the landscapes that we were seeing around us. I don't feel like that there was, like, you know, the discourse. There wasn't conversations about that. And again, maybe that's just me. Like maybe the way I grew up in Cork, urban. You know, like not. Yeah, we didn't have great access to nature, so maybe the conversations weren't being had. But I do feel like it's new, and there's kind of like a ground shift in Ireland, and I think there's opportunity in that, maybe because there aren't these entrenched views of decades of factions that don't speak to each other. So maybe we have an opportunity in Ireland to build those alliances because we're not at loggerheads with each other. I don't know.
Who agrees with that? I want to put a, you know, who agrees there's I'll try and make it as specific the question and really quick. Who agrees there is the opportunity to harvest the nature data and blah, 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 and then kind of develop, oh, I've phrased it so badly. And this is on film, can we take two? Who thinks there's the opportunity in Ireland where the data can be collected by people at grassroots and then outside experts could be brought in later, but they don't co-opt that information? Who thinks that opportunity is there based on that? How many? Just roughly put your hands up. What are we talking? Kind of 30? Okay, it's happening. Say 25% of the room there, roughly. Okay. I mean, it's also quite a threatening thing to say that, isn't it? Environmental NGOs are going to be threatened. Sorry.
I don't really believe that the data aren't collected. There's a national biodiversity data center that gives you the spread of every animal across the country.
Okay.
So the data is there.
But exactly, and that's just one type of data as well. I mean, I guess there's what they were saying about the soil is a totally different thing to that. But you're right, thankfully there is great places like that, exactly, collecting species data and stuff like that.
And who owns the data? Sorry, when I say who owns it,
Everyone can access them or
Good.
add to it.
Yeah. It's a government thing, and it's okay.
So
Yeah,
one of the
but it
things
could.
that's happened in recent years is that the catchments.ie website just has just water quality data, for example, land use data, that type of stuff is all readily available and freely available on the EPA websites. And that's a wealth of information for people who know that it's there and know how to get at it.
There we are. So if they knew it was there.
But it's all publicly available, you know?
But
Okay.
I feel it's all there.
Okay.
We all know the statistics, but it's time for connection and action.
Okay.
So the clinch for me is how to do that with the non-converted people.
Okay, well, we could open that can of worms quite soon. The unconnected people, but yes, you've got
Yeah,
to.
just the data, like the facts are irrelevant. You know, they're interesting, but they're irrelevant.
And there's a scientific paper that says exactly that there. It says facts are good, but they don't.
What matters is the story that we tell ourselves about our sense of place and our country. You know, that's what matters. We have all the data. The data doesn't, you know, it's kind of, it's irrelevant.
Okay.
Well, yeah. Yeah, no one has mentioned politics yet. Now, politics influences our environment in two ways. First of all, it allocates funding to certain organisations, and it may not allocate funding to others. And also, they keep looking at opinion polls, and if environmental issues aren't popular, they will shy away from them.
Okay, and it all depends what you ask in an opinion poll, doesn't it, as to what answer you.
No, we haven't, because like there's elections coming up.
Yes.
We see that people who are in environmental organisations are going to do very badly, and it's as if most people say, oh, we must do something about the environment, but just don't do it to me, do it to other people over there.
Okay. Thank you.
The premise that we need a green party at all is kind of, I think, a bit funny. Every political party should have a green element to it. You know, environment is part of government, not politics. I think there should be a distinction, but there isn't.
That's can I just, because you might have a great thought on this from the farming perspective. So say in Ireland, like when it comes to policy and how every party should say have a green part to them, you know, but then where did the policies come from? So say Fianna Fáil, Fine Gael, right? So say some of the early founding parties when we got our independence. My view always, when Ireland got our independence and we formed our own state, it was a little closer to under new management than independence. Like how we didn't look far, I don't think we looked far enough back at what are we doing for the Irish people. We took the industrial processes that the colonial regime had put in place in Ireland and we continued them and we railroaded them with the agricultural improvement schemes in the 1950s, you know, for straightening rivers. My own neighbour, Dan Crowley, wrote his memoirs, a tiny little book, and it was the most knowledge I've ever gotten in my life out of those 50 pages. And like the river we lived on, swam with as kids, I found out that it's all dairy farms now. That was all a bog, it was all heather, and that was a big meandering river that him and his brother got the first contracts in the 1950s. They bought the first tractor in the parish, and then they got the contracts to straighten all the rivers. So it's like that policy then came with the agricultural change, and then all of a sudden that worked because look, and then we joined the EU, and then we had huge agricultural expansion, and that policy again changed our landscape, it changed our culture. But now I'm saying, like, so say political parties who aren't very green in their ways, like, how do we get them to look back at, they think they've taken success, you know, they think they've delivered for the rural Ireland, but now we see that it's not the case environmentally and maybe socially as well, you know.
Yeah, so they've got to repurpose. So they're not trying to go back to it. So the Green Revolution, you know, the guy that won the Nobel Prize for saving millions of people in Asia because he basically started wheat that then could be, you know, grown with fertilizers. Everyone says, evil, bad person, but then he saved millions of people. We're not trying to disembowel that. We're trying to say that happened then. How do we repurpose agriculture for the new world where we need to extract less? The other elephant in the room is how do we reduce consumption, because that's related to this whole conversation, whether it's pine martens or whether it's, habitat and things like that. Our consumption is so related to everything, but that's a highly political. No party is going to tell anyone what to eat. Yeah, thank you.
So about the data being relevant or not, I think the data are maybe relevant, maybe irrelevant, but it also happens with them. So the data on the Irish forestry are that it's pretty bad. Okay.
In what way bad?
Well,
there isn't any.
Less than 1% wildlife.
The cover and the ecological health of it.
Okay,
so we have to look at not only who monopolizes the data in academia, but who actually manages the land, which in Ireland it's Quilcha that manages 7% of the land surface for forestry. And we see what they're doing. Oliver Rackham, the great English historical ecologist, he called the Irish forestry, I think, the most regrettable legacy of empire in Ireland.
Yeah. And he said a lot of things. The other thing he said, if you want to do conservation, eat Bambi. That didn't go down very well with the PR department, but basically, and also I think, what was the other thing that he said? He said a barbed wire fence is the only hope for conservation. Yeah. Do you hear that? Yeah, kind of 3 strands of barbed wire is the only hope for conservation.
He also said planting a tree was like sticking a knife in your stomach.
There we are. Look at that. Oliver Rackham reinvented. But that just shows, doesn't it? One person, you get so many different frames of what they're talking about, all relevant. And I think that's what this Alliance for Conservation is about. We've got 4 minutes, not 5. We're down to 4 minutes. This is what the Alliance for Conservation is about, is being able to kind of take in all the nuances, not let one be louder than the other, and then to somehow navigate a way forward. But there will be trade-offs, and I think we've got to talk about trade-offs. We haven't got time to do that in 4 minutes. Any other comments? And then we'll start to bring it back home to Home Tree.
But you know, just on the alliances there, like it's so possible, and it's funny because we've really touched on all the elements here. We've talked about data, we've talked about, there's land management, stakeholders, but it's as well being able to hold separate truths at the same time, especially from a values and a cultural sense. Because, when I worked in the Sliabh Auchties, with curlew conservation, we were there, it was myself, another ecologist, and 2 of our farmers, our neighbours who were farmers in the local gun club. They shot foxes and crows. We surveyed for the birds. We had the biggest success in curlews in that area because we had those lads who knew the rest of the lads. Everyone came on board. We were like, lads, do it. We helped them. We got them night vision scopes, better gear for hunting. We got them all stuff that you would never think goes in the conservation shopping basket when you're coming out with your butterfly net and your little hat, And it just was huge, to think that, when I tell people afterwards, my neighbours, I was once swiping through photos and she came across a picture where you'd have to send me photos of the amount of foxes they got in the night. And 3 of the most beautiful foxes I'd ever seen in my life just laid out dead on the thing, and my neighbour nearly burst out into tears, but then also was so delighted that I was doing something to help the curlews. And it's trying to show that to bring community together, we also have to have respect and an understanding that we're working for the same goal and that these things can happen together.
Absolutely, but it goes both ways. So I spent time talking to gamekeepers behind closed doors sometimes, saying maybe don't shoot the alpha fox because that could be the fox controlling the smaller foxes. It could be your friend. So some of the traditional land management practices might embrace some of the science and then blend it with the use of the rifle, but not necessarily shoot every single eye they see in the spotlight. Now, that's, it's not controversial, but it is in a way, because if you think about wolves, you shoot the alpha wolf and then the whole pack. That there are ways, no, not ways, that's what we're trying to explore in that 3 minutes, the ways to be able to have these multiple conversations in the brain at the same time and navigate a way through.
I think that's actually Ray's secret weapon is compassion.
I know how to fucking finish on me.
I'm not moving towards it. I just want to make sure the mic can hear you. So I'm not.
But I am interested because that's Rob's whole stick in England. So, do you have? I'm concerned about this weekend. It's been epic, but it's also been lots of talking. And have you seen, these alliances, strategies to make these alliances stronger and to allow them to deliver results? What have you seen that's good and has worked?
Yeah, I am like a firefly with a smoke bomb up my arse. What the fuck? Where did that come from? No, basically, look, 1 minute. No, we're going to wrap it up. Okay, I am going to finish what I'm going to say. Yeah, just to answer that, then we're going to have to 30 seconds. We've got to get recorded, you girls, because I want you in on it. I am very invigorated by this, because I've been in this area for about 25 years, so I'm aware of all these contested narratives, but I do see something in Ireland which is an opportunity, because it's not just low bar, because of the history, and I'm aware of all the history, and I'm so glad I stopped with the farmer on the way here to get 150 years of kind of potted history in 1 hour. There is that opportunity, and this comes back to Home Tree, I'm running out of time, but I think Home Tree, I think Home Tree is an opportunity, stop saying opportunity, to be a demonstration unit but without sponsorship?
10 seconds.
10 seconds. 10 seconds. Oh, you guys, thank you. If you're going to stop recording, I'm just going to say thank you to our lovely panelists, Jess and Jack.